What's up everyone? Today I'll be making this new router table to replace my old one that hopefully has better dust collection, is easier to use, and not overly complicated to make. The first step of the build is to break down all the sheet goods. I'm using 3/4 inch birch plywood for this project. It's the same stuff I've been making all my other shop furniture with. It was cheap, it has paper thin veneers on it, really hard to work with, and I can't wait till all this wood's used up. Once I have all the plywood broken down into manageable sections, I'll cut all the case parts out to size on the table saw. The case parts are made up of the sides, a shelf, and some dividers for some drawers that I'll add later. I've installed my dado stack to the table saw and I'm setting it to 3/8 of an inch deep so that I can cut some 3/4 inch dados in the case sides, dividers, and shelves. Here I'm raising the dado stack up into a sacrificial fence that I've installed in order to cut some 3/4 inch rabbets on the top of each case side, and then I'll repeat it on the top of the dividers as well. To create 1/4 inch rabbets for the back of the case sides, I just buried the blade deeper into the sacrificial fence. I need to make 1/4 inch grooves in each of the dividers and case sides in order to hold supports for the drawers, and I'll just make those with a couple passes with a regular table saw blade. I'm using this switchable magnet as a stop block at the bandsaw to create the toe kick on each case side. The last pieces I need to prepare for the case are these 1/4 inch pieces of plywood that are going to be the drawer dividers and the back of the case. I'll get everything cut to width at the table saw, and then I'll use the miter saw to cut them to their final length. Since there's a lot of parts to this case and it's going to be a little tricky to get glued up, I'm going to start by gluing and clamping the sides to the bottom and the middle shelf. Once all the base parts are assembled, I'll check to make sure that everything's square. Now I can work on getting the rest of the shelves and dividers glued up and clamped. The toe kick is going to be held together with some pocket screws, so I'll use the Kreg jig to get them all drilled out, and then I can get them installed to the case. While I'm waiting for the glue to dry on the case, I'll turn my attention to building the top for the router table. It's going to be made up of 2 pieces of 3/4 inch laminate plywood that is glued together. My old router table just had a hole cut in the middle of a piece of melamine and a router screwed to the bottom of it, and I got away with that for years. But this new one's going to have a router lift installed to make adjustments a lot easier. So once I get the 2 pieces of plywood cut out to size on the table saw, then I'll bring the router lift in and start laying out where it's going to sit. I'm using screws to hold the 2 pieces of the top together while the glue dries, so I'll drill some pilot holes, then I can spread the glue around, get the 2 pieces of the top put together, then come back in and install all the deck screws. Now I can take the top over to the table saw and square up all 4 sides. To install the router lift to the tabletop, I'm going to create this jig or template made out of some scrap plywood. I'm cutting out the pieces so that the plywood hangs over some of the edges and I can get clamps on them, and then make sure that all 4 sides fit snug around the router lift. The thin 1/4 inch plywood I'm installing here is really just going to hold all the other pieces of plywood into place, make the whole jig a little bit stronger. Most companies that make these router lifts also make a template that you can pick up for 40 or 50 bucks to make this process a little easier, but I didn't feel like waiting for one and I had the scraps on hand, so I just made it myself. Here I'm marking out where I have to cut all the way through the tabletop and where I need to leave a shoulder for the router lift to sit on. I'll be using a jigsaw to cut this hole out, so here I'm using a spade bit and my drill around all the corners just to make tracing the lines with the saw a little easier. I'm using a combination square to check how deep I need to make the shoulder for the router lift. Now with the template clamped in place, I can take a Forstner bit that's the same radius as the outside corners of the router lift and drill in as deep as I need to make the shoulders. Once I've drilled down on all 4 corners and made sure that I've got the depth right, I can come back in with my plunge router and a pattern bit and define the rest of the shoulders. Now I can do a test fit to make sure the router lift fits in the table properly. It should sit just a little bit below flush because the lift itself has some features or some set screws in it that you can adjust to bring up the lift to sit flush with the table. At this point, I'm going to move back to working on the case or the cabinet for the router table. I need to cut out all the parts for all the drawers and doors. I'll start by cutting all the parts the size of the table saw, and then I'll come back in and cut 1/4 inch grooves to accept drawer bottoms in the fronts, backs, and sides. And then I can cut some 1/4 inch plywood to size to make the drawer bottoms. The drawer fronts and backs are going to be held on with pocket screws, so here I'm just drilling them out with the jig, and then I can get all the drawers assembled. Next I need to install the hinges to the doors, and to do that I'm going to use this concealed hinge jig kit from Craig. I've been using this on quite a few projects. It's a pretty cheap jig, it's only about 30 bucks, and it's been saving me a lot of time. I install the hinges to the doors, and then I can install the doors to the case, and then I can come back and make any alignments or adjustments needed to make the doors fit to the case properly. Installing drawer fronts to the drawers are pretty easy. Just need to mark out where you want the drawer front to sit, cut it out at the table saw, install some double-sided tape, press it onto the drawer body, pull the drawer out, and then put a couple screws in from the back and reinstall it. Then I just repeat the process for all the other drawers. I made these drawers really simple with no drawer glides so that I could pull the whole drawer out and bring the router bits to the job site or a project if I was working away from the router table. Once the drawers and doors are finished, then I can install this 1/4 inch plywood into the shoulders I created earlier on the back of the cabinet. One big advantage over my last router table is that this one's going to have dust collection. Here I'm lining up where I'm going to add the 4-inch dust collection hose to the back of the router compartment. Then I'll cut the hole out with a jigsaw, and then I'm going to add some pocket holes in the back of this panel so I can attach it to the rest of the cabinet. If the router compartment's sealed up too tight, the dust collection won't work properly, so I'm adding 2 1-inch vents in the top of this panel. I can always come back and use these vents to fine-tune the airflow later. Now I can install the panel to the rest of the cabinet, and then install the dust collection adapter to the back of the panel. Here I'm installing the drawer pulls to all the drawers and the doors. This is the same drawer pulls I've been using for the miter saw station that I made and most of the other cabinetry in the shop. The router table top is going to float on the cabinet base. To do that, I'm going to just set the top in place, and I'm creating these blocks that I'll screw into the bottom of the top and wedge them between the router compartment divider that I put up and the other dividers that go to the drawers. This just kind of wedges the top in place. If I ever need to remove the whole top for anything, I can just lift it off the base. To trim out the top, I'm using this scrap oak that I have. It's the same stuff I've trimmed everything else in the shop with, so it'll match well. And I just cut it down to thin strips, and then I can apply it around the plywood parts of the tabletop, glue everything together, hit it with some brad nails. I'll use a block plane to get the oak flush with the tabletop, and then I'll come back and sand everything smooth. I'll be installing T-track across the router top in 3 places, all the way across the front and on the 2 sides for the router fence to ride in. To do that, I'm going to set up a straight edge against the front, then I can use my router to create the slot, and then I'll do the same process for the 2 sides. After everything's routed out, I'll square up the slots with a chisel. To cut the T-track to length, I just use a hacksaw. Then I'll come back with a file and file off the edges to make them smooth. And then I just use a blue Sharpie to match the blue on the T-track. And then I can get everything screwed into the router table top. The door for the router compartment is going to be made up of 3/8 inch thick acrylic. I'll cut it to size, and then I'll use a card scraper to smooth out the edges. Once that's done, I'll use a gas torch to make a couple passes along the edge, and that makes it nice, smooth, and shiny. I bought these hinges for the door off of Amazon, and they're meant to hold shower glass doors in place, so they just pinch the plexiglass. So I'll install those to the case, and then I'm just installing this stop board out of some scrap oak. And I'll put a handle on the door, and then I can install the door to the case. Then I'm going to drill a hole and install a small magnet in the door stop behind the handle to keep the door shut. To make the fence for this project, I'm going to start by cutting these triangle braces out at the miter saw. And while I'm here, I'll cut the sacrificial fence and the base to size 2. Over at the drill press, I'll use the stop block setup to drill some countersunk holes for the screws that'll go into the base and the fence. This is the base of the router table fence, and I need to cut this notch into the middle so that I can bury the router bits deeper into the fence, and this is also going to act as part of the dust collection. There's going to be a piece of T-track on the front of the fence right above the sacrificial fences, so I'm cutting this small strip of 3/4 inch plywood, and then I'll create a notch in it for the T-track to sit in. I'm using my palm router and a small fence to create a couple slots in the sacrificial fences so that I could slide them in and out and accommodate for different router bit sizes. Now I'm ready to start doing some assembly on the fence. I'll start by gluing down that 3/4 inch piece of plywood that I cut the notch in earlier. And then I can start to screw down the T-track. The screws I'm using will go all the way through the T-track into the base of the router fence. Afterwards, to attach the fence part to the base itself, I'm going to use some pocket holes to do that. So I'll get them cut out the jig, and then I can apply some glue to the base, clamp everything together, and then install the screws. The next step is to install all the supports or braces that I cut out earlier. When I originally drew up or sketched up the plans for this router table, I had 4 supports. And then when I started making this, I went back and made 2 more because things just didn't look like they were spaced evenly. This turned out to be a huge mistake that I'll explain in a couple minutes. After the supports are all secured, I can install this 2.5 inch dust port. Then I'll do a quick check to make sure that the fence sits square. Here I'm drilling a couple of holes and then coming back and countersinking them for a couple of bolts that'll go through the sacrificial fences into the base of the fence. All that's left now to finish the fence up is to slide the 2 sacrificial pieces in and get those tightened down. So to be completely transparent with you guys, here's where I made the big mistake. I installed those extra supports earlier, not realizing that they were going to interfere with where the T-track is. So I got a little aggravated, and not much else to do except for take a hammer and knock the supports off. It kind of damaged the plywood, as you can see there, and this was a really aggravating, irritating moment. But in the end, it sits behind the router table. Nobody's really going to see it but us. So I just took my hammer, knocked them off, and kept trudging along. I marked out where the T-track bolts and star knobs are going to go, and then went back to the drill press to drill out the holes for them. Because I had all kinds of splinters left over from knocking those supports off, I came back in with my sander, just tried to clean things up. I really honed in on the back of that fence to try to smooth out some of that damage and make it look a little better, but not really all that great. Okay, time to wrap this thing up. If you stuck around this far and you like the video at all, please consider subscribing and giving it a thumbs up. Once I got everything sanded down the best I could, then I'm ready to put the fence on the router table. So here you can see I'm just sticking the star knobs on the T-track bolts, getting everything put together. Then I do a quick check to see how the fence rides along the T-track. And now I'm starting to feel a little better because this thing operates really smooth and it locks down super tight. Now I can get the router installed into the lift, which is really easy on this model. Once that's done, I can install the router lift to the router table and make sure everything still sits nice and flush. Here I'm installing a paddle switch just to make it easy to turn the router on and off. For the couple of drawers that are going to hold router bits, I'm creating these inserts with 1/2 inch holes and 1/4 inch holes all throughout, just to be able to organize my bits a little bit better. It'd be easy to take out of the drawers and make it a lot easier to clean up. After I get everything drilled out, I'll use a countersink just to deburr and clean up all the holes. Then I'm ready to start organizing my bits and get them installed into the drawer. Now that everything's installed, I'm just doing a quick check of the router lift to see how smooth the operation is, and man is it nice. Next step is to get the dust collection all hooked up. So I'll start by connecting a 2.5 inch hose to the fence port, and then I have a Y that goes from the 4 inch dust collection hose So I'll get that installed, get the 2 hoses connected, and I should be good to go. I went ahead and hooked up the router table to the dust collection and gave it some test cuts. Here I'm using a 3/4 inch piece of scrap plywood, using a round over bit, and as you can see there's virtually no dust coming off of that. The fence router, or fence dust collection rather, is working really well. And then when I was finished up, I shut everything down and opened the door to the router compartment, and almost no dust in there either. I mean, this is really nice. Once I finished testing everything out, I gave the whole router table a coat of wipe-on polyurethane, and that finishes up this project. This router table has a lot of good storage for my extra routers, palm routers and stuff. I can keep my router bits. The drawers come all the way out, so if I'm doing a job off-site or at a different part of the shop with not the router table, I can bring the router bits to me. It stores all of my extra wrenches and pieces that come along with the routers, and just overall makes the process of using a router a lot easier. I've never been a fan of a router. I thought they were noisy and messy, but this project will really help me to keep the shop a little cleaner, make some better cuts with the router, and maybe enjoy the process a little more. Well, hope you guys liked the video, and if you did, consider giving it a thumbs up, leaving a comment, and subscribing to the channel. Alright, thanks guys. I'll see you in the next video.